They said 15 trained guards could calm any animal on the estate, but on that cold autumn morning, every one of them stepped back while a quiet maid carrying nothing but kindness took a single step forward. Before sunrise, the private stables behind Ethan Castellano's sprawling countryside estate echoed with frantic hoofbeats that rolled across the hills like distant thunder. The prized Black Stallion, a magnificent horse known throughout elite equestrian circles for its intelligence and untamed spirit, paced inside the enormous training paddock, refusing every command it had heard since dawn. Stable hands exchanged worried glances while security personnel formed a wide perimeter, careful to give the powerful animal space without allowing it to wander beyond the reinforced fencing. Ethan Castellano stood several yards away, perfectly still in a tailored charcoal overcoat, the faint tattoo climbing from beneath the collar of his white shirt visible against his pale neck. His expression never changed, but everyone around him recognized the silence that surrounded him whenever something truly mattered. This horse had been with him for years, long before his business empire reached its current influence, and he had made one rule absolutely clear. No one was to frighten the stallion. No one was to force it into submission. 15 guards had already tried every calm technique they knew, moving carefully, speaking softly, offering buckets of grain and fresh apples. Yet each attempt ended with the horse backing away, muscles tense, ears alert, unwilling to trust another outstretched hand. Even the experienced trainer quietly admitted he had never seen the stallion behave this way. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing minute as employees gathered near the stable doors, whispering among themselves while pretending not to stare. Among them walked Naomi Carter, a young black maid whose simple housekeeping uniform blended into the background so completely that most people barely noticed her passing. She carried a broom in one hand and a small wooden bucket in the other, moving carefully across the brick pathway before stopping as the anxious sounds reached her. Naomi rested the broom against the stable wall and watched in silence. Unlike everyone else, she did not focus on the horse's size or strength. She watched its breathing. She noticed the rapid movement of its ears, the tension in its shoulders, and the way its eyes searched every face before retreating again. Her hand instinctively rested against her pregnancy, as though reminding herself to move gently. Then she quietly reached into the feed room beside the stable. When she returned, the bucket was gone. Instead, several crisp apple slices rested in her open palm. She did not rush. She did not call for attention. She simply began walking toward the paddock at an unhurried pace. Conversations stopped one by one as employees noticed where she was going. A stable worker opened his mouth to stop her before another gently lowered his arm, curious to see what would happen. Ethan's eyes followed her for the first time that morning. He had seen Naomi cleaning hallways and polishing windows since she arrived at the estate several weeks earlier, but he knew almost nothing about her beyond her name. She reached the fence, paused, and remained perfectly still, allowing the morning breeze to carry the scent of fresh apples across the open space. The stallion lifted its head. For the first time all morning, the restless pacing slowed. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to soften as every person inside the stable realized they were witnessing something no amount of authority, experience, or influence had been able to accomplish. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her breathing slow enough that even the folds of her simple housekeeping uniform barely moved with each breath. The apple slices rested on her open palm, untouched, while the stallion studied her from across the paddock. She did not stare directly into its eyes. Instead, she watched the gentle rhythm of its chest, recognizing the uncertainty hidden beneath its restless movements. Around her, the employees shifted uneasily, but no one dared interrupt the silence. Ethan Castellano folded his hands behind his back without taking his eyes off the scene unfolding before him. Every expert he had, higher believed confidence came from control. This young woman seemed to believe confidence came from patience. The difference fascinated him more than he cared to admit. Another few seconds passed before the stallion cautiously lowered its head by a single inch. Naomi smiled almost imperceptibly, It was the smallest movement anyone there had seen from the animal all morning, yet to her it meant everything. She took one careful step closer, leaving several feet of respectful distance between herself and the horse. The breeze carried the scent of fresh apples once again, and the stallion inhaled deeply before taking one hesitant step forward. A stable hand quietly whispered that it had not approached anyone since sunrise. Another employee crossed his arms in disbelief. Ethan raised one finger without looking back, silently asking everyone to remain quiet. The estate became so still that the distant chirping of birds beyond the white wooden fences seemed louder than before. Naomi finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She did not issue commands or call the horse by name. She simply spoke with the calm reassurance someone might offer an old friend after a difficult day. Her words floated gently through the crisp morning air, steady and unhurried. The stallion flicked its ears toward her voice, then relaxed its neck another inch. Ethan noticed details no one else seemed to see. Naomi never reached toward the horse. She allowed the horse to choose every step. That realization stirred a memory buried deep within him. Years earlier, an elderly rancher had once told him that trust could never be demanded from a proud animal. It could only be offered and accepted freely. He had dismissed those words at the time, believing discipline solved everything. Watching Naomi, he wondered whether the old man had understood something he never had. Slowly, almost impossibly, the stallion crossed the remaining distance. Its powerful frame no longer radiated panic, but cautious curiosity. It stretched its neck forward, paused only inches from Naomi's hand, and gently accepted one apple slice before chewing slowly. No sudden movement followed. No anxious retreat. Instead, the horse remained exactly where it was, calmly waiting while Naomi offered another piece with the same quiet patience. A wave of astonishment swept across the gathered employees. Some exchanged emotional smiles, while others simply stared in speechless disbelief. The trainer removed his cap and shook his head with quiet admiration. Ethan remained silent, but something inside him shifted. For weeks, Naomi had walked these grounds unnoticed, cleaning hallways before dawn and leaving long after sunset, invisible to nearly everyone. Yet in a matter of minutes, she had accomplished what experience, authority, and reputation had failed to achieve. As the rising sun painted the stable roof with soft golden light, Ethan realized he no longer saw an anonymous maid standing beside his prized stallion. He saw someone carrying a rare kind of quiet strength, the kind that asked for nothing, expected no recognition, and somehow transformed fear into trust without anyone noticing how it happened. The quiet moment lingered long after the final apple slice disappeared, as though the entire estate had forgotten how to breathe. The stallion remained beside Naomi instead of returning to its restless pacing, lowering its powerful head while she slowly stroked the thick mane with careful respect rather than confidence. She never behaved as though she had accomplished something extraordinary. To her, this was simply how frightened animals deserve to be treated. Ethan Castellano watched every movement without speaking. Over the years, he had learned to recognize talent in business within minutes and loyalty in people over time. Yet this woman had revealed something entirely different. She possessed a calm that could not be purchased, taught, or demanded. It was simply part of who she was. Finally, he stepped closer, causing the nearby employees to instinctively move aside. Naomi immediately withdrew her hand from the stallion and took a respectful step backward, lowering her eyes. "I'm sorry if I crossed a boundary, sir," she said softly. "I only wanted to help." Ethan looked from her to the stallion, which remained unexpectedly relaxed, occasionally nudging Naomi's empty hand as though searching for another apple. A faint smile almost reached the corner of Ethan's mouth before disappearing again. "You crossed no boundary," he replied evenly. "You solved the problem that no one else could solve." The stable manager stared in disbelief. During years of working for Ethan, compliments were rare enough to become stories repeated for months. Hearing those words directed toward a housemaid felt almost impossible. Naomi seemed equally surprised. She quietly nodded, unsure how to respond, then glanced toward the broom, still leaning against the stable wall. "I should finish cleaning before breakfast preparations begin," she said. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her more carefully than ever before. Her housekeeping uniform was neatly pressed despite the early hour. A few loose curls had escaped beneath her headscarf during the morning's events, and one protective hand rested unconsciously against her pregnancy whenever she stood still. There was quiet dignity in everything she did, even when she believed no one was watching. "How did you know what the stallion needed?" Ethan finally asked. Naomi hesitated, almost embarrassed by the attention. "My father raised rescue horses in Kentucky," she answered. "He always told me that fear often looks like anger when nobody takes time to understand it. He said animals remember how people make them feel long after they forget voices or faces." The words settled over the stable with unexpected weight. Several workers exchanged thoughtful glances, realizing they had spent the entire morning trying to change the horse instead of changing their own approach. Ethan remained silent, repeating her father's words in his mind. Fear often looks like anger. Somehow those few simple words reached far beyond the stable itself. They reminded him of boardrooms, negotiations, strangers, and even his own life. The stallion gently rested its nose against Naomi's shoulder once more before calmly turning toward its water trough, moving with an ease that had been absent all morning. The trainer slowly released a breath he had been holding for nearly an hour. Around the stable, normal routines quietly resumed, but nothing truly felt ordinary anymore. As Naomi picked up her broom and began walking back toward the mansion without expecting another word, Ethan found himself watching until she disappeared beyond the white wooden fence. For the first time since she had arrived at the estate several weeks earlier, he realized he wanted to know the story of the woman everyone else had overlooked, because sometimes the most remarkable people entered a place without making any noise at all. The rest of the morning unfolded as though the estate itself had quietly shifted onto a different path. Naomi moved from room to room with the same steady rhythm she had followed since her first day, dusting polished shelves, arranging fresh flowers in oversized crystal vases, and wiping fingerprints from tall windows that overlooked rolling green pastures. Nothing about her routine changed, yet everything around her seemed different. Employees who had barely acknowledged her before now offered polite smiles as she passed. The stable manager nodded respectfully when their paths crossed. Even the kitchen staff spoke to her with a warmth she had never expected. Naomi accepted every gesture with quiet humility, never allowing herself to believe that one remarkable morning had changed her place inside such an enormous estate. Experience had taught her that admiration could disappear as quickly as it arrived. Shortly before noon, Ethan Castellano stood alone in the library overlooking the same fields where the black stallion now grazed peacefully beneath the autumn sun. A leather-bound notebook rested open on the desk before him, but he had not turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. His thoughts kept returning to the woman who had approached fear without demanding victory. He had spent years building an organization where preparation solved nearly every problem. Yet Naomi had relied on something entirely different. She had listened before acting. That realization unsettled him in the most unexpected way. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. His longtime estate manager stepped inside, carrying the daily schedule. After discussing appointments and deliveries, the older man hesitated before speaking again. "Sir, there is something you may want to know about Naomi Carter." Ethan looked up without saying a word. "She has never once asked for special treatment," the manager explained. Even after the doctor recommended lighter duties because of her pregnancy, she insisted on earning every hour of her paycheck. She always arrives before sunrise, and every Friday afternoon she sends most of her wages to her grandmother in Kentucky. Ethan remained quiet, absorbing details he had never considered important before. "Has she ever complained?" he finally asked. The manager slowly shook his head. "Not once. The only request she has ever made was permission to plant wildflowers beside the old stable, because she thought they would make the horses calmer. Ethan glanced toward the window again. Near the weathered fence, patches of yellow and purple flowers swayed gently in the breeze. He had noticed them weeks earlier without ever asking who had planted them. Now, he had his answer. Meanwhile, Naomi finished polishing the final hallway before carrying fresh linens toward the guest wing. As she rounded the corner overlooking the courtyard, she paused in surprise. The black stallion stood quietly inside a nearby paddock, and the moment it spotted her, it lifted its head and walked calmly toward the fence. The stable workers exchanged amused smiles, as though they had already expected the reaction. Naomi laughed softly, almost embarrassed by the attention, before reaching through the wooden rails to stroke the horse's forehead. The stallion leaned gently into her hand with complete trust. Unseen from the second-floor balcony above, Ethan witnessed the entire exchange without announcing his presence. He watched the horse relax before Naomi even spoke a single word. And for reasons he could not fully explain, that simple moment carried more meaning than any successful business meeting he had attended all year. Standing there beneath the quiet afternoon light, he began to understand that trust was not built through authority or reputation. Sometimes it appeared in silence, growing little by little until it transformed everyone fortunate enough to witness it. The following morning arrived wrapped in silver mist that drifted gently across the open fields, softening every fence and oak tree surrounding the estate. Long before the rest of the household gathered for breakfast, Naomi quietly walked toward the stable, carrying a small basket filled with fresh apples and a folded cleaning cloth. She had not been asked to return. In truth, she expected the previous day to become nothing more than an unusual memory before life settled back into its familiar routine. Yet the moment her footsteps reached the weathered stone path, the black stallion lifted its head from the pasture and walked toward the fence with calm anticipation. The stable workers noticed immediately. One smiled while another quietly remarked that the horse had ignored everyone else since sunrise, refusing its usual treats until now. Naomi laughed softly, almost shy at the unexpected attention, before offering a single apple slice through the wooden rails. The stallion accepted it gently, then remained beside her as she continued speaking in the same peaceful tone that had first earned its trust. She talked about the cool morning air, about the changing leaves, and about how her grandmother always believed animals enjoyed ordinary conversations more than commands. She never expected the horse to understand the words. She only believed it understood kindness. From the balcony overlooking the eastern gardens, Ethan Castellano watched without interrupting. He had adjusted his morning schedule twice already, though he would never admit the reason to anyone. Every instinct told him this scene deserved another look. He noticed how Naomi never rushed away, even though her workday had already begun. He noticed how the stallion seemed calmer simply because she stood nearby. Most of all, he noticed the expression on her face. There was no pride, no expectation of praise, only quiet contentment. That alone made her different from nearly everyone he had encountered throughout his career. Later that morning, Ethan instructed the estate manager to invite Naomi to the library after she completed her duties. When the message reached her, Naomi felt a quiet wave of uncertainty. She carefully washed her hands, smoothed the wrinkles from her simple housekeeping uniform, and made her way through the grand hallway lined with paintings and polished marble floors. The library doors stood open. Shelves filled with leather-bound books stretched from floor to ceiling, while warm sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the same pasture where the stallion now grazed peacefully. Ethan stood beside the fireplace with a cup of coffee resting untouched on the table beside him. He turned as Naomi entered and motioned toward a comfortable chair. She remained standing instead. "You asked to see me, sir," she said respectfully. Ethan studied her for a quiet moment before speaking. "The stable manager tells me the horse waits for you every morning." Naomi looked genuinely surprised. "I think he only remembers that I brought apples," she answered with a modest smile. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Animals remember far more than food." The room grew quiet again. Outside the window, Sunlight spread across the rolling fields, and somewhere in the distance the familiar sound of the stallion echoed softly across the estate. Ethan realized that the greatest change had not happened inside the stable. It had happened inside the people who witnessed that simple act of patience. The employees had begun treating one another with greater kindness. Conversations had become calmer, and even the atmosphere throughout the estate felt lighter. Looking at Naomi, he understood that genuine influence rarely announced itself. Sometimes it entered a place carrying nothing more than quiet compassion, changing hearts one unnoticed moment at a time. Naomi slowly took the seat Ethan had indicated, careful to keep her posture straight while folding her hands neatly in her lap. The library felt impossibly quiet compared to the lively sounds of the stable, and for a brief moment she wondered whether she had somehow made a mistake without realizing it. Ethan remained standing beside the tall windows, watching the golden afternoon sunlight stretch across the fields beyond the estate. Finally, he turned toward her with the same calm expression he carried in every business meeting, yet there was something noticeably different in his voice when he spoke. "Tell me about Kentucky," he said simply. Naomi blinked, surprised by the question. No employer had ever asked about her life before. Most wanted completed tasks, not personal stories. She hesitated for a second before answering honestly. "My grandfather owned a small horse farm outside Lexington," she said. "It was never large, but every horse there had been abandoned, injured, or forgotten by someone else. My father believed every animal deserved another chance, and he taught me to believe the same about people." Ethan listened without interrupting. Naomi smiled gently as memories surfaced. She described early mornings carrying buckets of water before school, brushing dusty coats beneath summer skies, and sitting quietly beside nervous horses until they trusted her enough to eat from her hand. She explained that her father never allowed loud voices around frightened animals. He always reminded her that fear became smaller when someone nearby refused to panic. Ethan found himself remembering those words alongside the ones she had shared the previous day. They carried a quiet wisdom that seemed strangely absent from the world he had spent years navigating. "What happened to the farm?" he asked. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a moment before answering. "After my father became ill, we could not afford to keep the property. We sold it, and I moved wherever work could be found. My grandmother stayed in Kentucky, and I send as much money home as I can." There was no bitterness in her voice, only gratitude for what those years had taught her. Ethan noticed that remarkable absence of resentment. Many people spoke endlessly about what life had taken from them. Naomi spoke only about what life had given her. Before either of them realized how much time had passed, the estate manager quietly entered carrying a folder. He apologized for the interruption and handed Ethan several documents requiring signatures. Ethan signed them almost absent-mindedly before looking back toward Naomi. "From this day forward," he said, "I would like you to spend part of each morning with the horses before beginning your regular duties." Naomi looked genuinely confused. "Sir, I am only a housemaid." Ethan shook his head. "You're someone they trust. That matters more than any job title." She searched for the right words, but found none. A quiet thank you was all she managed before lowering her eyes once again. As she left the library a few minutes later, the long hallway somehow felt brighter than before. Employees greeted her by name instead of simply nodding in passing. Outside, the black stallion stood peacefully beneath the shade of an old oak tree, lifting its head the instant Naomi stepped through the front doors. She smiled without thinking and walked toward the stable, unaware that from the library window, Ethan continued watching. For the first time in many years, he realized leadership was not always measured by the number of people willing to follow orders. Sometimes it was measured by the quiet ability to make others feel safe enough to become their very best selves. Over the next several days, a new rhythm quietly settled across the estate. Every morning before the sun climbed above the distant hills, Naomi visited the stable carrying nothing more than a small basket of sliced apples and a gentle smile. She spent only a few minutes with the horses before beginning her regular housekeeping duties. Yet those few minutes became the calmest part of the day, for everyone who worked nearby. The black stallion no longer paced restlessly whenever unfamiliar faces entered the stable. Instead, it waited patiently near the fence, almost as though it recognized the sound of Naomi's footsteps before she even appeared. Stable workers often paused from their chores simply to watch the peaceful routine unfold. They noticed that Naomi never treated the animal like a trophy or a challenge. She greeted it the same way she greeted every person she met, with quiet respect and patient kindness. Ethan Castellano also found his own routine changing in ways he had never expected. Without announcing it to anyone, he adjusted his morning schedule so that his first walk through the estate naturally passed by the stable. Officially, he claimed he wanted to inspect renovations and review maintenance reports. In truth, he found himself looking forward to those few quiet moments when he could observe Naomi speaking softly to the horses. There was something deeply reassuring about watching someone who expected nothing in return for the care they offered. One crisp morning, as sunlight filtered through the wooden beams above the stable, Ethan approached while Naomi gently brushed the stallion's mane. The horse acknowledged his presence with calm curiosity rather than nervous caution. Ethan stopped beside the fence and rested one hand on the polished rail. "He seems happier every day," he said. Naomi smiled while continuing slow, careful strokes along the horse's neck. "He feels safe now," she replied. Once an animal believes it belongs somewhere, it stops searching for danger in every shadow. Ethan remained thoughtful. "People are not very different," he admitted quietly. Naomi looked toward him with gentle surprise. She had never expected a man known for absolute confidence to speak with such honesty. For a moment, neither of them said another word. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled only with birdsong and the quiet sound of the stallion breathing peacefully nearby. Later that afternoon, the estate manager approached Ethan carrying several personnel reports. As they reviewed schedules together, the manager mentioned that staff morale had noticeably improved over the past week. Employees volunteered to help one another without being asked. Disagreements had become rare, and even new hires seemed more relaxed after spending time around the stable. Ethan listened carefully before closing the folder. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "one person changes an entire place without realizing it." Across the courtyard, Naomi finished sweeping the front walkway before stopping to admire the wildflowers blooming beside the stable fence. Their bright colors danced gently in the afternoon breeze, attracting butterflies that drifted lazily from blossom to blossom. She smiled, remembering how uncertain she had felt when planting those tiny seeds weeks earlier. Now they had grown into something beautiful, quietly transforming. An overlooked corner of the estate. Ethan watched from the library window once again, and it occurred to him that Naomi had done exactly the same thing with the people around her. She had arrived unnoticed, asked for nothing, expected nothing, and through countless small acts of patience had brought a quiet warmth that reached far beyond the stable walls. Standing there beneath the golden afternoon light, Ethan understood that the strongest foundations were rarely built through power alone. They were built through trust, kindness, and the courage to remain gentle in a world that often rewarded the opposite. One quiet Saturday morning, a gentle rain drifted across the countryside, leaving tiny drops of water sparkling on the white fences and turning the grassy fields into a sea of emerald green. Most of the estate remained peaceful as employees carried on with their usual routines, but the stable had become unusually busy because a local veterinarian was scheduled to perform a routine wellness examination for several of the horses. Naomi arrived carrying fresh towels and a basket of apples, expecting nothing more than another ordinary morning. The black stallion greeted her with the same calm affection it had shown every day since their first meeting, lowering its head while she softly brushed the damp strands of its mane. Nearby, Ethan Castellano spoke quietly with the veterinarian, reviewing feeding schedules and discussing long-term care for the animals. As the examination continued, a sudden clap of thunder echoed across the distant hills. It was not loud enough to frighten most of the horses, But one young colt in a neighboring paddock startled at the unfamiliar sound and began nervously circling the fence. Several stable workers immediately moved toward the frightened animal, speaking calmly while keeping a respectful distance. Naomi noticed the colt's anxious behavior before anyone else realized what was happening. Without hesitation, she slowly walked toward the smaller paddock, careful not to rush despite the slippery ground beneath her shoes. Ethan instinctively turned in her direction, prepared to call her back because of the rain and her pregnancy. But before he could speak, he saw the black stallion quietly follow several yards behind her. The magnificent horse stopped beside the fence, remaining perfectly calm while Naomi approached the nervous colt with slow, reassuring movements. She spoke in the same gentle voice she always used, allowing the frightened young horse to hear something familiar instead of another command. The colt gradually slowed its restless circling and lifted its ears toward her. At the same time, the black stallion remained completely still, almost as though offering silent reassurance simply by standing nearby. Everyone present watched in amazement as the younger horse mirrored that calm behavior within moments. The veterinarian smiled warmly before turning toward Ethan. "Animals learn trust from one another," he said quietly. "Sometimes the calmest teacher is not the person. Sometimes it is the example that person creates." Ethan remained silent as those words settled in his mind. He looked from Naomi to the black stallion, then to the young colt, now peacefully eating hay beside the fence. What had begun as one small act of kindness had quietly spread far beyond a single animal. It had changed the atmosphere of the entire stable. As the rain slowly faded and sunlight broke through the clouds, casting bright ribbons of light across the fields, the estate employees returned to their work with renewed smiles. Naomi thanked the veterinarian for his kind words, gathered her empty basket, and prepared to continue her housekeeping duties as though nothing unusual had happened. She never realized how many people had been inspired simply by watching her remain patient when others expected urgency. Ethan watched her disappear along the stone pathway toward the mansion, and for the first time in many years he understood that true leadership often begins with quiet example instead of loud instruction. The strongest influence in his estate did not come from authority, wealth, or reputation. It came from a woman who carried apples in one hand, hope in her heart, and enough kindness to transform every life she touched without ever asking to be noticed. Autumn gradually surrendered to the first hints of winter, yet the estate seemed warmer than it had been in years. The wildflowers Naomi had planted beside the stable had faded with the changing season, but their place was quietly taken by evergreen shrubs that the gardening staff added after saying they wanted the entrance to remain welcoming throughout the colder months. No one officially announced the change. It simply happened, much like every other quiet transformation that had spread across the property since Naomi first arrived. The stable had become a place where employees lingered a little longer before beginning their duties, exchanging friendly conversations instead of hurried instructions. The black stallion remained the calm center of that peaceful routine, greeting Naomi every morning with the same gentle curiosity that had once seemed impossible. Even visitors noticed the remarkable temperament of the horse and often asked the stable manager what special training methods had been introduced. He always smiled before giving the same simple answer. Nothing changed about the horse. Someone changed the atmosphere around him. One cool afternoon, Ethan Castellano invited every employee to gather in the courtyard for the annual appreciation luncheon, a tradition that had previously been formal, efficient, and quickly forgotten. This year felt different. Long wooden tables stretched beneath rows of string lights, while warm food, fresh bread, and homemade desserts filled the air with comforting aromas. Employees who normally worked in separate areas shared stories and laughter as though they had been neighbors for years. Naomi quietly took a seat near the end of one table, hoping not to draw attention to herself. She still believed she was simply doing the work she had been hired to do. As everyone settled into their seats, Ethan stood and looked across the courtyard. His voice remained calm, but every person listened carefully. Success is often measured by numbers, buildings, or achievements, he began. I spent many years believing that was enough. Recently, I was reminded that the true strength of any place is measured by how people treat one another when no one is watching. His eyes briefly met Naomi's before continuing. Kindness has a way of multiplying. One quiet act becomes another, then another, until an entire community changes without realizing when it began. No names were mentioned, yet everyone understood exactly whom he was describing. Naomi lowered her eyes, feeling both humbled and deeply grateful. The applause that followed was gentle rather than overwhelming, carrying respect instead of celebration. After lunch, employees slowly returned to their work while the afternoon sun painted long golden shadows across the fields. Naomi made her usual visit to the stable before finishing her shift. The black stallion walked toward her with relaxed confidence, resting its head lightly beside her shoulder as though greeting an old friend. Ethan happened to pass by on his evening walk and paused several yards away. This time he did not remain hidden. Naomi noticed him and smiled warmly. "He seems happy today," she said. Ethan nodded. "I think we all are." For a quiet moment, the three of them stood beneath the fading light without another word. Beyond the white fences, the rolling hills stretched toward the horizon, peaceful and unchanged, yet somehow everything felt different. Naomi eventually gathered her basket and began walking back toward the mansion, where another ordinary day of work still awaited her. She remained the same thoughtful woman who had first arrived, carrying little more than hope and determination. Ethan watched her disappear along the familiar stone path, realizing that the greatest legacy a person could leave behind was not built through wealth, influence, or reputation, but through the quiet courage to offer compassion without expecting recognition. And on that peaceful estate, where a frightened horse had once refused every outstretched hand, everyone had learned that dignity grows strongest wherever kindness is freely given. And that was the day they all remembered what quiet strength truly looked like.